Alright, so it turns out we don't have to wait for Game Informer to release subsequent articles in regards to their Final Fantasy VII Rebirth coverage because they've made the entire cover story from their magazine free to read for everyone online. All you gotta do is go to the Game Informer app and you can read this entire story for free. So that's what we're gonna do in today's video. We're gonna go through and just kind of pick out some of the more interesting parts of the story because it covers the span of the beginning of Final Fantasy VII Remake all the way to where we are now with Rebirth. So if any of that sounds cool to you, feel free to click the like button, and if you're new here and you'd like to stick around, you can subscribe as well. Now, of course, obviously Game Informer will continue to put out their articles in regards to this cover story, and if there's anything new in those articles that maybe isn't mentioned in the cover story, or maybe they go a little bit more in depth with that stuff, I'll make sure to check it out here on the channel. But starting off first, they go back to the moment where Final Fantasy VII Remake was first revealed to all of us, and they recount the experience that Tetsuya Nomura had when that trailer was first revealed. Nomura goes on to say, "There were no staff members around, so I was kind of just off to the side standing there alone. When I heard the cheers from the crowd and the passion, I became overwhelmed and I started shivering. I was walking like a fawn, just overwhelmed by the intensity of the crowd. I thought, this has become such a big deal and I wanted to cry." Me and you both, Nomura. I will never forget where I was at that E3 when they revealed the first official announcement trailer for Final Fantasy VII Remake. I was on my parents' couch, I was watching the PlayStation press conference on my iPad when suddenly the presenter on stage, whose name I'm forgetting, has the live stream appear behind him, and he starts to talk about one of the bigger franchises in gaming, and this trailer starts to play, and everyone kind of has the same reaction of, wait a minute, is this a sequel or is this going to be a movie? And finally we see Barrett and we see Cloud and the screen goes black and the words show up on the screen, Remake, and everybody loses their minds. There are countless reaction videos to that announcement from like Game Trailers crew and Maximilian Dude, and it just was an incredible feeling because it felt like for one night, for one single night, the entire Final Fantasy fandom, especially the 7 fandom, was united because the thing that we thought was never going to happen was happening. Final Fantasy VII was getting a remake, and it was an incredible experience, and from time to time, I still go back and check out those reaction videos because it just brings me so much joy. Up next, they talk about the road leading up to that specific moment and how Nomura was really planning how they could do a remake in the early 2000s for Final Fantasy VII, but unfortunately at that time, a majority of the key people who would work on that remake just were busy doing other projects, so it was never something that could come to fruition at that point in time. Next, Kitase remembers the moment specifically that they needed to get the ball rolling on a Final Fantasy VII Remake and how much demand there actually was. He goes on to say, "We were on the US media tour for Final Fantasy XIII, and we took a bunch of interviews, and we got a ton of questions from reporters asking, when are we going to make a Final Fantasy VII Remake? Just hearing that so many times, I did think that we would do it one day, that's for certain," which is something that I'm sure that they've been badgered by for so many years prior to that. When's Final Fantasy VII Remake happening? And I remember that tech demo that came out for the PlayStation 3, where it was Cloud getting off of the train in Midgar, and it was never meant to be an announcement or a hint at a remake. It was just, here's a tech demo, this is how powerful the PlayStation 3 is. And people took that and ran thinking, yeah, that remake is happening, it's just a matter of time. Nomura also does chime in on how they knew that now was exactly the time to make Final Fantasy VII Remake. Within Square Enix, gradually, remakes were being made, and these ideas for remakes were coming up in other departments. If we weren't going to do Final Fantasy VII, others were going to do it, so we had to rise up and do it. We had that sense that we had to guard Final Fantasy VII, and have to be the ones taking this on, or someone else is going to do it. I thought it may be a bit too troublesome if other teams without us took on the project. Now, interestingly enough, they don't talk about the period of time where Final Fantasy VII Remake was being developed by CyberConnect2, which granted, I don't think it was a very long piece of time, but they were the ones originally developing this remake. They created a lot of the earlier assets, and the footage for their version of the game still exists online. It was from one of the PlayStation experiences where they showed up the first gameplay trailer, and the game looks a little bit different nowadays from the final product, but characters like Barrett look vastly different different in this trailer from CyberConnect2 than they do in the final game. And the gameplay itself was definitely different. It seemed much more akin to what we saw in the Kingdom Hearts games, where you have that command-based menu on the side that you would navigate with the D-pad, your character info on the right side of the screen, so on and so forth. And to this day, I'm still haven't been able to find concrete information as to why exactly Square Enix was unhappy, or maybe just didn't like what CyberConnect2 was doing, so they inevitably brought the game in-house to be developed by Creative Business Unit 1. Up next, they basically talk about assembling the equivalent of the Avengers to craft Final Fantasy VII Remake, and that includes people like Katsuhige Nojima, who is the original scenario writer. He's also writing the Remake trilogy, as well as Motomo Toriyama, who also worked on the original Final Fantasy VII. And what's really interesting is that Toriyama brings up kind of what the ratio of the development team is, and how it does consist of OG people that worked on the original FF7, but it also does include a number of people that grew up playing it. He goes on to say, I would say the majority of the dev staff and production members are those who were players of the original, not creators. So it's really cool to get concrete information on that, because we've talked about that ad nauseum of how this development team is, you know, OGs and people who grew up playing the game, and how that's just something really special. But to learn that a lot of the dev team is actually the newer people is super cool. And it kind of seems like a majority of maybe the people that are like the heads of each department are the OG people, and a lot of the people under them are the ones who grew up playing the game. But that's pretty cool to learn. And they do go on to talk about some of those newer devs, which include Naoki Hamaguchi, who we've talked about ad nauseum on this page. The guy's incredible. He knows what he's doing with Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. I think the game's gonna hopefully come out great because he is a fan first and foremost, so he knows how important this franchise really is. And then of course you have Teruki Endo, who would be the game's battle director, and initially he worked at Capcom making the Monster Hunter games, but once he caught wind that this was happening, he just had to be a part of it. Endo goes on to say, I was working for another gaming company when I heard they were looking for members to be involved on the battle side of creating this game, and felt like this was a great opportunity in which I could utilize the skills that I had gained thus far working in the industry. And thankfully he did, because they crafted one of, in my opinion, the best battle systems I've seen in an action RPG to date. Up next, Endo goes on to talk a little bit more about crafting that battle system that was created in Remake. Seeing that the Final Fantasy series has a strong focus on its characters, I believe the action enhances this and lets the players be further immersed into the characters as they play. Along with the strategic battles that I believe are key to Final Fantasy VII, I wanted to see how best I could mix these two elements of the command and strategy-based battle with the action that allows for that instant immersion. And that's something that Nomura resonated with. Nomura goes on to say, I do have this idea of how Final Fantasy battles should be and should feel. We want to still keep this strategy element in which the player will consider the elemental weaknesses of enemies during the battle while using these action moves and being engaged intact. That was always my core belief in how we should approach Final Fantasy battles. I thought this was truly vital to this game. I didn't want it to be a game where it's reflex type action or reflex based battle. We wanted to combine all of these elements, which is a pretty stark contrast to what we got in Final Fantasy XVI, which is definitely much more of a pure action game when it comes to its combat. Clive is a very fast mobile character that relies on combos and special abilities, but there's no elemental weaknesses in 16, which is a gripe that some people did have. So in 16, Clive has the ability to shoot magic off. Sometimes it's fire, sometimes it's ice, sometimes it's like darkness with Odin or wind or what have you. But if you hit a fire enemy with a fire spell in 16, you don't heal them, you still do damage to them. And that does take a little element of strategy away from the combat in 16, because again, Clive is so fast and furious that you can basically mow through a lot of the enemies without too much thought. It's not really until you get to the boss battles and the hunt battles where you have to be really reflex heavy and dodging and counterattacking and using your special abilities to make the most out of that fight. And I really loved how they do it in Remake. Again, that action element is still there, but also that RPG element that a lot of people missed from 16 is there, with the elemental weaknesses and strategizing with your materia and your specific weapons that have certain abilities on them that you can then utilize in specific battles. There's so much that goes into it that what they crafted and is just absolutely incredible in my opinion. Up next, they start to get a little bit more in depth with Sephiroth and how he's starting to appear a lot more in the Remake trilogy. Kitase goes on to say, Remake covers your encounter with Sephiroth, and now within Rebirth, we wanted to make Sephiroth into this very clear antagonist and target for the characters to go and pursue throughout their journey in Rebirth. Within the original game, Sephiroth is not seen very much within the world map, but in this title, we put this element forward, which I really like. There are some people who are a bit iffy on it. They don't like that Sephiroth's showing up as often as he does, but it makes it more interesting and more mysterious, because when Sephiroth shows up now in a spot where he didn't in the original, it makes me as a player question, okay, what's going on? What new is going to happen? What story advancements are going to now take place? And it also adds to the fear of Sephiroth, because we talked about this in a previous video about boss inflation and how in some RPGs you have so many different bosses that just appear one after another that it makes the previous one just kind of look bad, because you think you're fighting the big bad, but nope, you take him out and boom, there's somebody behind him. And in Final Fantasy VII, that's not the case. Sephiroth is the end all be all big bad. So when he does show up, that's your cue to go, oh no, some serious stuff is going to go down, because he's here now. There's no one behind him. It's the real deal, which I love. I think that is incredible. Now up next, they talk about Sephiroth as a playable character, and this quote is very, very interesting, and this comes from Endo. He says, when developing Sephiroth as a character who players are able to control in a limited area, we're still considering that you're able to play as this very iconic character. Taking this into mind, I really took care into providing these sort of resources and cost as equal to those of other playable characters into developing Sephiroth in a battle sense, which is nuts. So they basically treated Sephiroth, this character that, as of right now, as far as we know, is only playable in the flashback, and they put resources and money into building him as if he's going to be a character that you use throughout the entire game. That to me is astounding, and it shows again how much love and care went into creating this game and the different characters that you're going to utilize, because somebody like Sephiroth, who again, as far as we know, is only in the flashback, they treated him like a full-fledged character, which, you know, some people are speculating like, they treated him like a full-fledged character. He's got a big moveset, list of abilities. Is it possible that at some point in time in the game, he will join our party as a fully playable character? I'm kind of holding out hope that that will happen for good guy Sephiroth to show up and we can use him in our party, but who the hell knows? Hamaguchi also goes on and chimes in about creating Sephiroth as this character that you kind of feel sorry for. He says, we felt it was necessary to have this very clear depiction of how he came to be the person that he is now in Rebirth. Even as a developer creating this game, seeing Sephiroth discover the truth and fall further and further into darkness, like falling from grace, and depicting this in his expressions and actions, I could truly feel bad for him. Throughout the course of Rebirth, I believe players will not only grow to relate and understand Cloud, but also Sephiroth through this game much more. And again, like I said before, that's a very fine line you have to straddle. You gotta give the player enough information to perhaps empathize with Sephiroth, maybe not to the point where you're officially on his side and you agree with all of the things that he's doing, but enough to understand, okay, this is who he is. And I've mentioned this in previous videos, but some of the scariest, best villains in media are the villains who think that what they are doing is right. Sephiroth, you know, little by little, or not really little by little, because it all happens pretty fast, he breaks down. He loses his identity and he doesn't really know who he is anymore. It causes his brain to literally just kind of crack. And that's the birth of that villain. That's his origin story. So to get more information on who he was prior to the break and why he is the way that he is, I think is very intriguing. And to me, that just makes him an even more interesting character. And even though this is a remake and they're retelling certain aspects, we're still getting new bits of info on these characters as well as the story that helps keep things feel fresh. And even though the remake itself, the story is supposed to be pretty much the same as the original game, those little scenarios in between the big plot points where things are going to be different is really exciting. Now up next, they talk about the elephant in the room, and they even title this section of the article, Reborn Only to Die, in reference to, again, spoiler alert for those who have made it this far, if you haven't played the original FF7, there is a character that does die, and I'm going to talk about that, so you've been warned. But Obviously, in the OG FF7, the character of Aerith does die. And this was brought up to the development team by the author of this cover story, and they go on to say, "When I asked the development team about this scene," meaning Aerith's death, "the previously jovial mood dropped into a somber state. While the team is tight-lipped about how the events will play out, it insists it has achieved something that will shock even the players who have played through the scene in question multiple times." Now this to me, there's so many theories flying around right now, but the biggest one is that, yeah, Aerith will die, but perhaps her consciousness will travel over into the Aerith that exists in Zack's time. So a transference of consciousness, which seemingly Aerith can do. She is one with the live stream. She's perhaps the one sending current Aerith images of what's been happening and feeding her information. So it's entirely possible that yes, she does die and we see her get taken away from us, but the shocking aspect is maybe she is alive in a new timeline now with the same info that she had from the previous timeline. And I've brought this up in older videos, but it is possible that Aerith survives her original fate only to realize that yeah, in order for Cloud and the party to be successful against Sephiroth, she does inevitably have to die. It's such a key part of that story that having her stay alive, I think would change things pretty drastically. And Nomura ends this entire thing with a very beautiful and poignant series of quotes that I think we can all relate to. He says, "Beginning with the original Final Fantasy VII, when we had started working on it, it was already decided from the get-go that life would be the central theme surrounding Final Fantasy VII. I knew that we had to depict life and death within this title. Prior to Final Fantasy VII, there had been other titles where characters have experienced tragedy, but many of them have come back or been revived in some way. But I believe that loss is something that happens unexpectedly, and it's not something so dramatic or drawn out, but is something in which a person that you have just conversed with is suddenly gone and never to come back. I believe that the person who dies should not return in this title, and that is what we did with the original." I did get a little choked up reading parts of that because I think that's one of the reasons why Final Fantasy VII, out of all the Final Fantasies, just kind of clicked with so many people and has remained as popular as it is because it has themes that we can all relate to. Obviously, there's themes of like corporate greed, environmental concerns, mental health, but one of the biggest themes is loss. And that's what Final Fantasy is. Every single character in that game, in the main cast, and even some of the side characters have lost something, whether it was a person, a thing, their home, they've lost it. Sephiroth, the villain, he loses who he is. His identity comes crashing down when he discovers Genova and the secrets behind his, creation. All of these characters have lost something, and that's why I think we connect so much with it, because we've all lost something at some point in time. And it's how those characters deal with that loss, how that loss changes them, how they grow, is what makes those characters in that story so fascinating, in my opinion. And reading Nomura's quote, I think was really beautiful, and it kind of choked me up a bit because I've lost both sets of my grandparents throughout my life, and I remember how that affected me, and I remember how it affected my family. I've also lost, pets, and I currently have a dog who I love with all my heart. She's like my kid, and I know there's going to come a day when she's not here with me anymore, and I don't know how I'm going to handle that. Probably not well, but I think that's why we connect so much with Final Fantasy VII, and I think that's why Final Fantasy VII in particular just endures as a franchise. So with that being said, that is the Game Informer cover story. I'm going to try my best not to break down and start crying right now talking about all this stuff, but those words from Nomura just kind of hit me really hard. As always, let me know what you guys think in the comments down below. This was a much longer video than usual, but the cover story itself was very long, and I thought there was a lot of really interesting things to talk about for this video. And again, if more articles do come out and they have, more detailed info on the gameplay and some of the story stuff, we'll take a look at it here on the channel. But for now, that is the video. I'm Curious Corduroy. I will see you guys in the next video. Please remember to always be excellent to one another.